My name is Hannes Kools. I'm in the third year of my PhD at the Institute for Media Studies at the University of Leuven. And this is actually the last research we did when algorithms recommend what is news, new dynamics of gatekeeping and agenda setting in newsroom innovation labs. A brief introduction. What we saw during the literature review is that nowadays, you see research emerging, looking also at the interaction between, on the one hand, a news worker or a journalist, and on the one hand, what we call computational journalistic tools. I really wanted to dive deeper into that because that is also one of the focuses in my PhD trajectory. And we really wanted to look at news gathering because when we were reading about tools that are being implemented in a news ecosystem or in a news outlet, we saw that a lot of research has been done on, for example, news distribution, news production, things like that, but not a lot about news gathering. And we really wanted to focus on two core roles of journalists or news workers, so to say. On the one hand, gatekeeping, and on the other hand, agenda setting. So if we look at newsrooms today, and that's also something what Bianca touched upon, and I believe other scholars as well today, is that you see that newsrooms are changing. Before I started my PhD, I worked also as a journalist, and I saw that tools were being implemented in a news ecosystem, and they were somehow, in a way, changing work packages of journalists, and sometimes journalists really didn't like that. So since the term of gatekeeping got introduced by Manning White in the 1950s, you could say that what he called Mr. Gates, like selecting what is news and what is not news, that got like different phases along the way with the introduction of the internet, but also now with smart tools that are being fueled with artificial intelligence, algorithms, things like that. So you could argue that those computational journalistic tools could be like intervening factors, could intervene in the daily work processes of journalists, so to say. Then we came up, of course, with a definition of gatekeeping, more in the digital age, so more embedded in like 2021, so to say. So the process of selecting, writing, editing, positioning, scheduling, repeating, and otherwise massaging information to become news. For the sake of this research, we only focused on news gathering, like I said before. What we looked at and what we reviewed specifically in this paper is we looked at algorithmic news recommenders, and that's kind of like a new thing. You see that mostly in newsroom innovation labs, those kind of tools are being determined and being implemented in the newsroom, but they're rather fresh tools that are being used. You have different types of algorithmic news recommenders. That's also in a study by Nathalie Hellberger. And we only focused on the first one. So on content-based recommendation, news recommenders, so to say. You also have like insights based on what other users like to read, based on, for example, data about their users, things like that. But we only focused on content-based algorithmic news recommenders because we really wanted to look at news gathering. If you would take, for example, collaborative filtering or knowledge-based systems, those are more situated in the news distribution or news moderation phase. So content-based it is. And actually, because of the implementation of algorithmic news recommenders, you see that there are new ways in discovering news, but also like what the angle of the news article could be. So these ANRs and the way they collect and analyze data have the potential also to serve as a tool for news workers. That's also what we found in our study, that it is one tool in a larger toolkit of news workers, but that it can be useful, especially sometimes during news peaks. But I will come to that in a minute. So what can it do? It can present recommendations for news articles to journalists. It can also detect breaking news events, and it can make predictions. Just to give you an example, for example, the Washington Post, they worked with a tool called Lead Locator, and they used it during the presidential elections, but I believe also during other elections, more state-wise elections. And what it did was it looked at voter data, and then it put that data in kind of tip sheet, and that tip sheet would then be presented to the journalists. So it's really in the news gathering phase, in a moment where there's a lot of news. And then you have this tool that is saying, well, this could potentially be newsworthy. And that is also a bit the conclusion for why we wanted to do that study is we wanted to advance our understanding of the news worker and the A&R interaction. So how that works, as it has become more complex and unclear who makes the decisions, selects the news, and sets the digital agenda. If, for example, you have a tip sheet that is being presented to a journalist, if he uses that, then somehow the A&R has also a say in what kind of news reaches the audience in conclusion. Two research questions. We had more research questions, but I highlighted two just because of time constraints. So how do members of Newsroom Innovation Labs experience A&Rs on the news workers' daily decisions in news gathering? And then the other one is, how do members of Newsroom Innovation Labs consider the influence of A&R on the autonomy of setting the agenda? So certain topics setting the agenda. So if a tip sheet is presented, how does that work? Do news workers still have the feeling that they have a lot of autonomy or not? So of course, in the questionnaire, we focus on the two core roles. So we split that up. For gatekeeping and for agenda setting and the processes that get involved with that in the news gathering phase. And we did expert interviews with 19 members of Newsroom Innovation Labs, more the larger newsrooms, because we've also seen that those A&Rs are being implemented right now already in like the larger newsrooms, so to say. So we really wanted to grasp how they work with that, also to, for example, tweak it with other maybe smaller newsrooms as well. Just to give you some results, so I highlighted some quotes of the expert interviews to give you a more nuanced overview of how people or how news workers make sense of A&Rs. So for example, respondent 12, he said, like, we use those A&Rs as a shovel, some respondents even said like a compass, to look at things that could be newsworthy and that maybe already affirm what their journalistic gut feeling is telling them. But they use it sometimes during newspeak moments like election reporting, but also like during the COVID-19 pandemic, where there's a lot of news, just to get it one tool apart from other tools. So for example, they would also use like Twitter to look up some news and things like that. And some respondents said like it really optimizes the decisions sometimes that I make. I have maybe more angles that are being presented to me than if I just would scroll down Twitter, my Twitter feed, or my contacts in my email. Then another thing is some journalists who started using the A&R, they have become lazy. So members of Newsroom Innovation Labs, they said like, we implemented a tool, for example, in the health department of the newsroom, and people just started using it, thinking it would not make any mistake. So respondents said like the fate in the tool sometimes transcends the criticism, and that is also linked to what respondent 2 is saying, that a lot of news workers really do not care how that tool comes to a certain conclusion. Like I was saying with the lead locator, how do you go from the tool getting the data into a tip sheet? When does a tool decide when something is newsworthy? So things like that also need to be more transparent in the interaction between the A&R on the one hand and the news worker on the other hand. So for example, one newsroom, they added like a disclaimer to the A&R saying like, well, it's a tool, so it can still make mistakes. Another thing that was very central, I think almost all respondents said that is that the autonomy in the interaction between the A&R and the news worker, for the news worker, it is very, very crucial that he or she has like the end decision. So the A&R can interact, of course, saying like, this could be newsworthy, but not like really deciding like this is news and then they just go on with it. So the journalistic autonomy is very, very important in this study, or that came through in the results. And then also other newsroom innovation labs, more the German ones, said like that the language models are not sufficient enough, so that they decided, they worked on a certain tool, but they decided not to use it in the end, so not implement it in the newsroom. For agenda setting, I'll just go quick over that. So journalists do not want a tool like an A&R that makes decisions for them, says respondent 4. So some journalists really don't like A&Rs like interfering with their daily practices, so to say. And also you have, when journalists grasp better what those A&Rs can do, for example, in order to suggest what is newsworthy, then they will better make use of it, so that they will start trusting it sometimes instead of distrusting it. And also it smoothens sometimes the process of putting certain topics on the agenda. But, and that was also something that came forward in the gatekeeping section, news workers will remain in the loop. And that brings me to some preliminary conclusions. So for the first research question, really on gatekeeping, on saying like, what is news, things like that. Some news workers see it as a shovel, or maybe even as a compass. So tools that already affirm what their just journalistic gut feeling has told them. And also that those A&Rs in news gathering are mainly used during news peaks. So also another respondent said with the Capitol Hill protests and things like that, they use those A&Rs to get different angles, get more diversity, so to say, and that you have like more suggestions of what could be newsworthy. But on the other hand, news workers discover the limits of the technology that drives A&R, calling the journalistic autonomy in the interaction with the tool all important. So what I was saying, like autonomy is really crucial and central in this A&R news worker interaction. And then also it gives a glimpse of the interaction between a news worker and the A&R in the future, where specific journalistic roles and work packages will be transformed and maybe partially assigned to a tool. And then for research question 2 is that for agenda setting specifically, you see a positive acceleration effect. Respondents are saying that ensures that news leads can offer greater diversity in topics that are put on the agenda. But again, the autonomy is very, very important. And then you have also another dichotomy, a trust-distrust dichotomy that a lot of journalists sometimes already pro forma decide not to use those kind of tools. But this is really linked also to like a bunch of literature talking about the greater tension between the Newsroom Innovation Labs members, because we only talk to them. And that's also a limitation of the study, and the larger, more conservative newsroom. But we're basically now working on a second study, looking also more at the journalists, so not in the Newsroom Innovation Lab, but in the broader news ecosystem. So that's it for now.